Mr. Vice President, we deeply thank you for your participation, for your remarks, which definitely stage the proceedings of this conference. I would like only to say one word about the great support this chamber have had from the international relations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, specifically Mr. Panagiotis Michalos. We thank you deeply, sir, for all the support you gave for the success of this conference. We thank you very much. Ministers, ambassadors, I think this year we have a quite balanced agenda in order to present and discuss virtually all the key issues which are related with the oil and gas developments in this part of the world. Issues related with the restructuring of the electricity market and the potential of the renewable sector. Today's agenda, as we have announced, and you all have enhanced the program, we have three key topics. We will open with Europe's new energy agenda, with the participation of the Greek Minister of Environment. Kyria Maniati, we thank you very much. The U.S. Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy at the U.S. Department of State, the Deputy Director General of the European Commission, and the Energy Diplomacy Coordinator. We shall continue later with a most interesting discussion of the Southern Gas Corridor, its importance for Europe's gas security, and we will elaborate on the benefits for this region. And today's proceedings, we will close with a presentation, a discussion about the new recent discoveries of the natural gas reserves in Israel and in Cyprus, and the potential existence of oil and gas reserves in Greece, and what is the impact of these energy sources on the European Union energy supply. Tomorrow again, we're going to have three very interesting projects about discussions about electricity, about renewables, and the forum will open around 9:30 in the morning. I would like only to say a word of thanks to Mr. Theodore Tsakiris, professor at the University of Nicosia and scientific advisor of this conference, who helped us a lot in putting out the agenda of this conference. With this, I would like to kindly ask Mr. Andritsos from Sky to moderate the next discussion. Kyrie Andritso.
Κυρίες και κύριοι,
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you for my part. Welcome to the Athens Energy Forum 2014. For the next hour or so, I will be privileged to be joined by interlocutors that are very critical to the Greek Presidency of the Council of the European Union and Europe's new energy agenda. Today's discussion, of course, it is to be understood. We had the opening keynote address. This is the best point in time for having such a discussion, I think. If this is good or bad, well, that remains to be seen. It will be determined by developments. So developments due to the Ukrainian crisis go to show that we have the issues of energy safety and security that are still major concerns of ours if we want to make sure that we will transport relevant resources and fuel through Europe. Bearing in mind that, according to analysts, this is the most serious such crisis between Russia and the West, and bearing in mind that almost all EU member states are fully dependent energy-wise on Russia, it is imperative that we look into, or rather that we reconsider the ways in which Europe has been managing this ever-increasing dependence of its. At the same point in time, what Europe is still looking for is capitalizing on its own resources, finding new resources, taking advantage of them, And of course, this needs to be tackled on a European scale, which brings me to a challenging or provocative even question. Energy policies within the EU have, I wonder, been made the way that the single currency was made? Has maybe such a policy been created taking into account just the good case scenario and not the bad case? Well, I'm not going to dwell on this any longer, nor am I going to take up any more of your time. So I will invite the Minister of Environment, Energy and Climate Change. Maybe soon you will be Minister for Oil, Mr. Maniatis. In any case, please be so kind as to take the floor.
Τέτοιου είδους ευχές είναι πάντα...
I guess that everyone agrees that it's quite positive to have that added to my title, not for my sake, but for the sake of the country. Let me welcome each and every one of you, ladies and gentlemen, especially our dear guests. It is also worth noting that here we are today. We are convening at the capital city of the country that is currently exercising the presidency of the EU Council. And I'm sure that your forum's conclusions will be very useful, not just for Greece, but for all EU citizens, and most certainly for all policies and statespeople throughout Europe. Let me seize this opportunity to actually change the text that I have prepared. And I'm changing the introduction because Mr. Venizelos made a remark earlier on. He actually said that it would be useful at the level of the EU to have a single and shared negotiation stance or point of view, an approach, if you will, especially with regard to raw materials and the prices thereof, i.e. natural gas. And this would be useful because that way we could have a certain equilibrium from a negotiation point of view. We would strike a balance between those big countries that are powerful and buy huge quantities and they're at the heart of Europe, and the small and weak countries, or rather those countries who are at the end or the borders of the EU and they need smaller quantities of fuel. So let me start from that point. Mr. Andritsos, after all, made a relevant remark himself. Let us have a look at where we stand today. Today, we are working within the confines of a union that is going through its fifth or maybe sixth consecutive year. It's still of a recession and a financial crisis. We are still going through recession, and one of the main reasons behind the crisis is the fact that we have a union that is incomplete from an economic point of view, economic union point of view, that is. So where exactly are we today? We are within the supranational construct, an edifice that consists of 28 member states, out of which more than 50% has a single currency, and still none of the 28 member states has a single fiscal and banking policy. This is what we're faced with, which means that in order for us to really mobilize resources, economies, and people, we need ideally a fiscal policy, a banking policy, and a single currency. And out of these, as you notice, parameters are missing. The single currency is there, the other two are missing. And this is probably the main reason why we're faced with the crisis the way we experience it within the EU. Now, can we draw any parallels with the energy sector? Unfortunately, there is such a parallel because you see, the energy sector within the EU, unfortunately, so far has been dealt with as a single market, and just a single market, that's all. Which means that we've been dealing with energy, trying to have an overall set of parameters in order to produce and consume intrinsic energy resources. But you see, still, we are missing, just like what the Deputy Prime Minister said, what's missing right now in the energy field is a single negotiation stance or framework vis-à-vis third countries that are providing energy resources to the member states of the EU. And there's yet another thing missing, and so the relevant or necessary triangle for the energy sector is still incomplete, because we're also missing a single and common stance of the EU as one supranational entity vis-à-vis the infrastructures, the networks, the pipelines that can no longer be treated as national or transnational clusters or unions. They need to be faced with as European interconnectors instead. In a nutshell, or to put it in layman's terms, a pipeline which provides for or to the needs of the member states is not just relevant to the countries it goes through, but it's relevant to and should concern the EU overall. And so it needs to be dealt with as infrastructure that needs funding by all of the EU. Or if we fail to do so, in the energy field, we will still be making the same tragic mistakes that we've made in the single currency of ours. Let me now read from what I prepared for you, because this is clearly and directly associated with the presidency. The presidency's policies have been shaped gradually, and they focus on competitive pricing for all to cater to the needs of the industry and the households, but it's also been determined by environmental change parameters. But the ever-increasing dependence on imports is very important when it comes to us gradually shifting over to a low-carbon emission economy. A few years ago, Europe undertook the 2020 initiative, 20% less emissions, 20% change in the mix, and 20% energy saving. And Europe is doing quite well in that field, and I expect such objectives to materialize by 2020. As of that time, things have changed, or at least some things have changed. First, there's a crisis. The crisis is there. The crisis is real. And unfortunately, even when the crisis will no longer be there, it will still leave gaping wounds behind. And such wounds will force all European societies to look at everything anew, including energy. So we will be eventually faced with difficulties for finding new and generous resources for new energy infrastructure. That's point one. Point two, households and industrial plants or industries and industrial sector, due to specific developments in Europe in recent years, have been faced with exceptionally high energy prices, and this affects both the industry and the households. And show gas developments in the US are also quite a telling example, because such developments are providing households and industries with scope to have significantly smaller energy costs. And this is so much so that it actually impacts and influences greatly the European economy. In 2012, 400 billion euros were spent in the energy sector in Europe. That's annual expenses, or 3.1% of the GDP of the EU. Or, in other words, about 1,000 euros per European citizen. And one last introductory remark. Obviously, there's a shift in the sense that in previous days, Europe and the United States of America were the leaders of the whole process and procedures, especially as concerned consumption. Now we have India, China, and please bear in mind there are also the Gulf countries because they are no longer just producers, but they are also high consumption countries energy-wise. Let us also take into account the fact that countries such as Italy and Germany, who are using a lot of power and energy, decided nonetheless to close down or phase out their nuclear plants after the Fukushima accident. And these, of course, will exercise more pressure in terms of pricing, which is expected, prices in natural gas prices, for that matter, are expected to rise. The EU is currently importing 60% of natural gas it consumes, 80% of oil it uses, and 50% of coal. According to the International Energy Agency, in 2035, in just 20 years from now, this sort of dependence will increase. And so instead of 80%, we will get to 90% for oil. And instead of 60%, we will get to or be in excess of 80%, again, within the EU. It is for these reasons that we decided under the presidency of Greece, when we met, me and my peers, to discuss sustainability and energy policies and pricing energy costs for the industry and households, especially vulnerable ones, we decided that all of the aforementioned would be dealt with by the EU presidency, which is being exercised by Greece. We are striving to strike a balance in terms of our aspirations, because we believe that the EU should still be ambitious in terms of forthcomingly dealing with climate change, especially in view of the World Conference that is convening next year in Paris. But we're always careful with competitiveness issues because we want to ensure competitiveness of the European industries. In other words, energy and everything we do in this field is not an end in itself, because the end objective should be related to the energy poor citizens and European workers who are working within the energy sector, and we have to keep their industries going or else they're going to lose their jobs. And rightfully so, all of the aforementioned will be discussed in the next summit that we're going to have. And in that summit, presidents, rather heads of state and government, including prime ministers and presidents, will convene and talk about competitiveness, energy cost, and protection of households. Which brings me to Greece. And since in the meetings we had in Brussels, we have, in our capacity as presiding country, to keep a neutral position. Quite often there are views that are at the other extreme. Nonetheless, we need to acquaint people with our objectives in view of 2030. So 40% less or fewer greenhouse emissions by comparison to the respective statistics in 1990. It's also important, that's point two, to go from 27%, which is proposed by the European Commission, to 30% in terms of using RES in the energy balance we are striking. Third, instead of waiting for the European Commission to complete its own evaluation and assessment this September of actions and activities to ensure energy efficiency, maybe we need to make a decision right now so as for us to save 30% primary energy in view of 2030. Fourth objective, 100% of energy or electric energy consumers, electric power consumers, should have so-called smart meters. And 100% of the Greek citizen needs to be interconnected from an energy or electric power point of view. In other words, islands which are still cut off from the grid should have such connections and be attached to the grid and do so at 100%. We need a competitive single energy market that will have increased cash flow. This is the type of energy market that needs to cater to the needs of everyone, especially by providing natural gas. Despite changes we've seen in the market, positive changes in recent years, we still have to strive harder so as for us to improve competition and deal with challenges. Such political events in suppliers or in transit countries, accidents or natural disasters remind the European Union that we are very sensitive and sensible vis-à-vis any changes in the energy supplies and such networks. Each and every country is responsible for safe supplies, but solidarity amongst member states is a fundamental feature for taking part in the European Union. Within the single energy market, national solutions are quite often insufficient. Given developments, the EU has to actually do something about protecting its interests. We have to do something in order to make sure that we have in place an effective policy, energy policy, while deepening our relations with the prominent suppliers and consumers. At the same time, we also have to promote PCIs and make them happen. Europe needs to continue its efforts with a view to its diversifying its networks, channels and resources by capitalizing on its own capacities and further developing the Eastern Corridor, gas corridor, to get gas from the Caspian Sea, the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean countries. The selection of TAP and the decision on Sardini's 2 as an investment project are landmarks when it comes to the efforts that the EU has been exerting for 20 years with a view to having such goals materialize and provide diversified solutions to Europe. The strategic importance and significance of TAP is important regardless of quantities. TAP is contributing to the diversification of the EU's resources, and it's also providing new channels and pipelines and options for Europe, not just the solutions that are offered by Russia, Norway, the North Sea or Africa, since in 2010 such networks and channels provided the EU with 75% of our inputs. We have a PCN for the years that will follow through Sardini's, and we managed to do so, and this was an objective for us in the past 15 years. Moreover, there's scope for us to take part in the TAP joint venture by 50%, and there will be various benefits as a result thereof. There's a challenge for the EU today. The challenge lies with ensuring access to diversified energy sources in more countries, and especially in Eastern and Central European countries. Moreover, challenge lies with doing away with inequalities, so minimizing inequalities between, on the one hand, the most integrated markets of the EU, which were in a position to take advantage of the competitive pricing of natural gas, and on the other hand, those more isolated or cut-off countries that are more exposed to higher prices, which also consecutively undermines the integrity of the internal market. This is exactly what Mr. Andrizzo said, but I put it in more diplomatic terms. So we have to have the relevant infrastructure in place, and we also have to maximize what we can do with smaller pipelines. The Greek-Bulgarian pipeline, IGB, is the characteristic case at hand because such a pipeline could help. Greece has co-signed cooperation agreements to connect TAP and the Greek-Bulgarian pipeline in order for us to make sure that we will have more supplies into that part and cater to the needs of Romania and the Visegrad countries. We are also encouraging the interconnection of TAP with other EU partners of ours by fostering new synergies, and such efforts so far have led to the signing of a common declaration between the 8 parties or countries involved, including the Western Balkan countries, with a view to having cooperation within the framework of the Ionian Adriatic pipeline. In addition to that, as concerns the IGB, we had a meeting with my colleague, the Assistant Secretary for Energy from Bulgaria, and I'd like to welcome him. In 2016, we expect that, thanks to funds provided through various sources, we will be promoting a number of projects, and Revithusa will be taken advantage of. At the same time, we will also be using floating plants, LNG terminals in northern Greece, and they can play an exceptionally interesting role. So we have compressors, reverse flow compressors, and let me once again remind everyone of the fact that Greece is always interested in and supportive of the Burgas-Alexandroupolis pipelines, because this pipeline, which is always an issue on the agenda every time we have bilateral meetings. Greece in Southern East Mediterranean, Greece, Cyprus and Israel. After we signed a relevant memorandum, an MOU, in the field of energy last summer, these 3 countries are now a new source for supplying the EU with energy. We have to deal with these 3 countries as such, and they lie at the end of the EU, territorially speaking, and they act and operate in an area that is always faced with tumult and upheaval, but they can also act as means and countries that will ensure stability and steadiness in terms of energy supplying for Europe. So this is a new source and new supply resources. Greece and Cyprus have already included the pipeline that connects the Greek-Israeli reserves, and it goes through Cyprus, the Peloponnese, through Italy. This is the so-called East Med. We've already taken note of it, and there is also the Vasilikon LNG terminal. We have included both among our projects of European interest, and they can act adjunctively and complementary to one another to ensure and guarantee there is a solution to what the EU is always agonizing over. For such are the means through which we can ensure peace and quiet in terms of energy and the supply thereof. Europe, moreover, needs to support and beef up its own production of raw materials. I'm referring mostly to hydrocarbons. Now, Greece is going past the memorandum and the crisis, and eventually it will heavily count on its own wealth, its raw materials, resources, mineral rather, and we have a clear place on the energy chessboard. We are becoming a paragon for peace, stability and growth in the wider region. Greece is going to look into capitalizing the wider spectrum of our resources throughout our territory, wherever we exercise our sovereignty rights, always with full respect to international prerequisites and principles. We will have international calls for tender and bids, and we will provide transparent, relevant information and data, because all respective deals and agreements will be ratified by the Greek Parliament. We want the Greek communities to have a dividend out of growth and resources that the nature placed in specific areas and locations. Fully capitalizing on hydrocarbons will happen by focusing mostly on employing Greek labor force, and we will quote-unquote Hellenicize research on a scientific and economic point of view. There will be lots of jobs, direct and indirect employment for that matter. Already we have redesigned all the curricula, undergraduate and graduate or even postgraduate, in Greek universities that are somehow connected to the mineral resources and such resources, energy resources in Greece. Already this has been revised, all the curricula, in cooperation with the Ministry of Education. It's not just about geologists or mineral experts and engineers, be they oil engineers or other. We expect to also get the law profession to pitch in, environmental experts to pitch in, the field of economy. So we expect all major disciplines to pitch in one way or another. So in essence, we are opening up a new market, a market that will be propped up by all sorts of experts. The Ionian Sea and the seas south of Crete are quite promising already. We've set up a data room in the context of our ministry. It's up and running, it's effective, it's also important to mention that today, as we speak, we are making a presentation in London, a presentation on Greek resources. We had such a presentation made a few days ago in Houston, US. Let me remind you, Minister, but that you don't have more than 5 minutes. I should be done in a minute or so. I know that I've actually taken up too much of your time, and thank you for being so understanding. One last thing, let me underscore the fact that the challenges we're faced with within Europe call for stronger cooperation, while at the same time it's important for us to beef up scope there is for negotiation to ensure energy safety and security. We have to insist on the fiscal and banking unification amongst us, and the fact that we just have the single currency, nothing else to work for us, ought to be taken into account if we want to do away with deficits that are in the energy sector. It's a fact that when member states act on their own individually, they will just fail to deal with safety and security issues. And the EU has proven that whenever it's acted in unison as a collective body, it's managed to achieve results that were impressive, results that were impossible for any individual member state to achieve. And this is why it is important that further steps be made so that cohesion be increased for the EU in the field of energy. This has always been our position, and we, as the presidency, we will work hard to achieve so much. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον κύριο Υπουργό.
Let us thank the Minister. Please be so kind as to refrain from asking questions right now. Let us instead give the floor to the rest of the panelists first, and then we can have a general discussion. And I know we're pressed for time, the way things are going. In any case, let me now give the floor to Mr. Fabrizio Barbasso, who's Deputy Director General for Energy. Mr. Barbasso, please join us up here, rather the panel. Let me also... Please be seated, Mr. Barbasso, and let me also welcome Mr. Alexandros Yannis, who is an energy diplomacy coordinator working for the European External Action Service of the EU. Mr. Yannis will also be joining us shortly, hopefully, and let me also invite Mr. Barbasso. Would you like to sit here? And let me also invite Amos Hochstein, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy, Bureau of Energy Resources, U.S. Department of State. So, sir, you're kindly asked to join me and take the floor.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, everybody, for being here and for the kind invitation to speak here today, which I'm very excited about. I want to particularly thank the New York Times and Kathy Marini. As a New Yorker, it's great to come to Athens to speak at a conference that is co-hosted by my childhood paper, Mr. Samokos, and the Greek government. And thank you to Minister Maniatis for your great remarks. And frankly, there's a lot of things that I was planning on saying today that I now don't need to say. because of the comments by Minister Maniatis, which I thought were very thoughtful and really hit the mark on a lot of the issues that we're facing today. You know, I want to make two basic points here today, and I think they're closely interconnected. The first is that the energy picture in Europe, which is transforming rapidly, as we all know, is part of a global shift in energy. And as we talk about energy in Europe, we have to always remember that energy in Europe is not in isolation. It is through the context of the global market that it has to be seen. And the second message is to underscore the United States' commitment to energy security in Europe. Energy security in Europe is in the U.S. national security. And as President of the EU, we look forward to working with the government of Greece as we face these challenges in energy security. And I think nobody thought we'd be dealing with the energy security challenges quite so soon in your presidency, but clearly now is one of those times. Let me start with before I get to the messages to explain, which I think gives the context of these comments, is where I come from. I used to get a lot of questions of what does that mean to be in the Energy Bureau or Energy Division of the State Department, of the Foreign Ministry. 3 years ago, Secretary Hillary Clinton, when she looked at the State Department and foreign policy and national security of the United States and global stability, realized that the one area that we were woefully unprepared for was in the area of energy, and created a division inside the State Department that will be people who understand the energy markets, but also have a seat at the energy security, at the national security table, and therefore created the Bureau of Energy Resources. Today we have close to 90 staff in the State Department working on global energy issues, from oil and gas to renewables to transparency and good governance, energy poverty, etc. Let me start with the global context. Energy shapes national interests and relations between nations. It shapes politics, development, assistance programs, governance between nations, and it shapes the security and stability of the climate and our environment. And therefore our job, our collective job, is to consider all of these factors within the global context. As we look at energy today, and we talked about some of the particulars already, it's important to note that two historic processes are happening, and by coincidence, they're happening at the same time. The first is that there's a tremendous change in demand structure. While until now, demand was governed by the United States and Western Europe, today we know that for the next several decades at least, the non-OECD countries are going to be driving demand. Last year marked the first time in history that oil demand from developing economies surpassed that of developing nations. And in 2012, China's net oil imports exceeded those of the United States for the very first time, and that will be the trend for the foreseeable future. The strains on resource availability will continue to increase, therefore, and in the future, China and India's demand for energy will drive global energy commodity prices. So as we talk about Europe, it's important to note that there are these great powers and shifts, tectonic shifts in energy. But while we're looking at a energy demand restructuring, at the very same time and for unrelated reasons, we're also looking at a tremendous change on the supply side. It's no longer the big energy producers of yesterday who push fuels in one direction for consumers via transmission that they control. It's no longer, I build a pipeline, it's my oil, it's my gas, the pipeline ends in your country, you're the recipient, we have a Catholic marriage of sorts, you're stuck with me and I'm stuck with you, and I therefore control it because I'm the producer. That world is over. Everything is becoming distributed. But we're also seeing a myriad of new sources coming online. It's no longer the OPEC countries. It's now East Africa and West Africa and North Africa and Australia and Southeast Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean and ultimately the United States. The largest finds over the last several years have not been in the traditional producers, in both oil and gas. They've been in Israel and Mozambique and Tanzania and Ghana, an enormous amount of gas in Australia. These changes are striking, and we feel them everywhere, whether it's in Washington, Brussels, in North Dakota, in Athens, and around the world. In the United States, when President Obama came into power, he received a briefing on energy, and he was told the thing to watch is the relationship with gas producers, because we're going to be increasing our gas production over the next several decades by exponential amounts. Today, we don't import any gas outside of our neighbors. And in just a couple of years, we will be beginning the process of exporting. Our first exports will come online in early 2016. Today, we are the largest gas producer in the world. And in a short while, by the end of the decade, we'll be one of the largest oil producers in the world. And Mr. Minister, you talked about before about predictions about oil prices and so on. So the first lessons that I've learned is that if I was able to predict oil prices, I'd be working somewhere else and wear a more expensive suit. But it's also important to note from these lessons, if you look at any prediction in 2009 or 2008, they were all wrong. So while we have to make decisions based on data, we have to always remember that there is that concept out there in the energy markets that you never know. We've already had an impact on the market as the United States, because all the gas that was destined and contracted for the United States today flows to other markets, including Europe and Asia. Our commitment to the energy security in Europe has never been stronger, but it's also been consistent for a very long time. We've supported our European partners in your efforts to diversify energy sources and routes with commercially viable projects that will ease reliance on a single major supplier, stabilize regional markets as a result, and help connect Eastern Europe and the Baltic region to Greater Europe. We were active participants in the Southern Corridor, and to open that corridor to where it is today, which following the FID that just occurred, the final investment decision by the Shah Deniz Consortium in December, and coupled with the decision to select TAP as the pipeline route to Europe, that means the conversation today is entirely around implementation and not about the vision. In this respect, the government of Greece deserves enormous amount of credit for strong commitment to the Southern Corridor and its equally strong support for TAP and its continued support for TAP, which is an integral part of the Southern Corridor. And I want to underscore that point, because I think sometimes the government in Greece doesn't get enough credit for this. TAP, and to say it to my friends from TAP, TAP doesn't get enough credit. Not a lot of folks thought TAP had a chance of success. And it's through enormous amount of work and strong support from the government of Greece that TAP was selected. We, the United States, we were neutral. We had only one position: build it. Get new gas supplies, new gas sources into Europe, and get it done as fast as possible. We urge the parties to focus on not the politics, but the commercial nature of it. And that's what Greece did, and that's what TAP did, and that's what led to its success. And as a result, TAP may be an 870-kilometer pipeline project that has 10 BCM, but it's part of a much bigger project for Europe, a $45 billion project, 4,000 kilometers of pipe. And what that means is that here in Greece alone, that's $2 billion of new money, of new investment, of private, not institutional, not the government's, new money to come into this economy, and somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 jobs, new jobs in Greece. That's something Greece needs, and that's on top of the cherry of this whole thing, which is more energy independence, more energy diversification. As the EU project of common interest, I'm hoping that that also means that we get a lot of EU support, which we have had all along. But the Southern Corridor is not a magic silver bullet in the energy picture for Europe. Europe consumes over 500 BCM per year, and the Southern Corridor is 10. And it could be expanded. But even when it gets expanded, my hope is gas use and demand will expand as well. We need to see the project move forward. We need TAP to finalize the different areas that they need to with governments in the area, and I'm sure they will get the support, and that it serves the region as well as possible. That means that it's not just about the 3 countries that are recipients of the gas. It means that, as the minister talked about, and I was very glad to hear you say that gas to Bulgaria through the IGB, through the interconnector Greece-Bulgaria, is an important project. And while we in the United States have been talking about the IGB for a long time, and people sometimes look at us, all right, relax. I don't think in the last 2 weeks anybody has questioned why we have been so committed that IGB is important and it needs to be part and parcel of the project. And I'm glad to see that the Deputy Minister from Bulgaria is here. And I think that's a strong statement of the relationship between the 2 countries and the interconnection of Bulgaria to TAP. But that's not all it is. And I'm cutting what I needed to say about this because, Mr. Minister, you addressed it well. It's about all the interconnections that TAP can have. The Ionic Adriatic pipeline that you mentioned, and I just spent the earlier part of this week in Croatia and in Hungary. This region, now that TAP has been selected, gives us the ability to look after the countries that we're not taken care of as a result of not being selected through the Nabucco West. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not that TAP was selected, Nabucco lost, so we're now moving on. We need to make sure that energy security is energy security for everyone in Europe. And if Croatia and Hungary can resolve their differences over the INA situation and get back to working together on it, in that case, the LNG facility in Kirk Island is a distinct possibility. When there is more gas in the pipeline, IAP, the Ionic Adriatic pipeline, could be more of a possibility, and that means that gas from this region can go all the way up to Ukraine, if there's enough gas. But we need to look at some of the other interconnections. Hungary and Slovakia are going to open an interconnection there, and really Southeast Europe is now a model for how we can interconnect the region through pipelines, through creativity. And I want to commend the EU, who since 2009, after the shutdown then, we're in a different world today. Because the EU took some courageous steps on regulation and the third energy package, which we continue to encourage all countries to come into compliance with. And that means that we have a much more diverse, more energy security throughout the region. Not enough, but we're in a much better place today than we were then. Fortunately, at this point, we also understand that there's been no interruption yet of oil and natural gas exports from Russia to Ukraine and through there to Europe. European gas inventories are well above normal levels for this season because of a milder winter, and they could replace a loss of Russian exports for several months if necessary. It's not on an equal basis, and Greece is in a different situation than the rest of Europe. But I must say this, that frankly, any disruption to Russia's energy shipments to Ukraine and Europe is a lose-lose proposition for everyone, with Russia losing out more than anyone else. Russia is heavily dependent on Europe and Ukraine as critical export markets for its natural gas, earning some $50 billion a year from these sales. And a large part of economic stability is investor confidence. This is especially true in energy, where energy companies must invest billions of dollars with the expectation of making their profits back years later. Russia's actions are a warning sign for any investor and call into question their reliability and motivation as a supplier. The mere fact that we all question whether a supply disruption is possible is a statement in of itself. We will do everything we can to be supportive. And I know a lot of questions were raised about LNG exports from the United States. So instead of waiting for the Q&A, let me just answer that right away. The Department of Energy has already conditionally approved 6 LNG permits for 8.5 billion cubic feet per day that can be exported to countries with which we do not have a free trade agreement, including those in Europe. We remain committed to the increased energy security, diversity in supply, and competitive markets that such exports will promote. And we've already seen how increased supply competition in Europe has put downward pressure on natural gas prices. However, the first project to export this gas is only expected to come online, as I said, in early 2016. And in the interim, increased U.S. domestic natural gas production will continue to free up those gas supplies to Europe. But Europe has a key role to play in supporting the shift to greater energy security. As I said, we need to see more countries adopting the third energy package. We need to look to Southeast Europe as the model of interconnection and continue it. We need to identify what still needs to be done in key places that will allow the LNG from new sources to actually arrive in Europe, and increased infrastructure investment in nuclear and renewables, and everything has to fit in all of the above approach. Not every country that has a coastline needs an LNG facility. Sometimes if you look around statements around Europe, you would think that that is not the case. We have to think about some of the questions that were raised by the minister about the Eastern Mediterranean, and I don't think I need to go into any of the details on that, because I think in this part of the world everybody's very focused on what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I want to underscore only one statement that the minister said. We often talk about energy in the context of conflict, and these days more than most days. But energy could serve as an area of cooperation to change some of conflict dynamics, and we're already seeing that in the Eastern Mediterranean. I serve as a mediator to one of the more probable places for energy conflict, or for any conflict, between Israel and Lebanon, where there is a maritime dispute. And it's remarkable because we've been able to avoid conflict, when in prior times this kind of an area of dispute has caused great conflict. But Israel, Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, even though it doesn't have a coastline. These are all areas, all countries, that can get together around the concept of Eastern Mediterranean energy finds and better their political situation and their economic situation.
May I remind you?
I'm just going to close now. Thanks. Returning to the global context as I close, the decisions you make here in Greece, or in Rome, or in Tirana, are directly linked to those that are made in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. The global shifts in demand and supply raise those geopolitical questions, but they can be overcome. And as I have just outlined, even with our increased self-sufficiency in energy, we will never pull back from Europe or from the rest of the world. We will remain engaged, remain committed to energy security, to our friends and allies throughout Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hogstein. Very, extremely interesting point. Mr. Barbas, the floor is yours. From the European Commission.
Minister Magnatis, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's amazing to what extent United States and Europe speak with one voice when talking about energy security in Europe. This happened already in the past with your predecessor, Richard Morningstar, and the same with you, but I could tell you exactly what Mr. Hochstein told you. For example, the opening of the Southern Corridor, the need to interconnect the Southern Corridor with the other countries of Central and Southern East Europe, and also on the East Mediterranean. We are speaking with one voice. And you are probably aware that there is a body of cooperation which is called the USA Energy Council, which meets regularly and where we try as much as possible to coordinate our policy. But from what I hear, from what we say vis-à-vis the third countries, we can assume that this body work has been successful so far. I would like to come back to the topic of this session. And this is about one of the main weaknesses of Europe, the fact that we depend to a very large extent on importing energy sources from elsewhere. Minister Magnatis has already provided you with many figures on this high level of dependency for gas, for oil, and the perspectives for the future. I know that Mr. Hochstein doesn't believe in perspectives, but nevertheless, in some cases, it might happen that perspectives are correct. So we have a trade deficit for oil fuels, oil, gas, coal, and even uranium. And this cost to European citizens a lot of money. Europe has spent 500 billion euros last year to buy gas and oil from elsewhere. So we have to tackle this issue as a matter of urgency and as a matter of high importance, also because of the strategic implications in terms of competitiveness of the European system, because one of the three elements of energy price, the fuels, is determined outside Europe. So we depend very much on prices which are fixed elsewhere. And second, if you think of what's going on today, where the possibility of applying sanctions to a big supplier of energy to European countries is raising the sensitive issue of the backfiring, the impact on the consuming countries in Europe. So this means that until the date where we are so largely dependent on imports, our energy policy is too much influenced from abroad. So what is the European response to all that? We are trying to promote four main strands, four main pillars in order to mitigate this aspect which depends on factual elements. So it takes time to find alternative ways and means to alleviate this dependency. First one has been stressed by the two ministers before is the building, the completion of the internal market. Internal market is not only a set of rules. By the way, you have been invited by our American friend to implement the rules, not only to transpose them into the various national legislations. It's not only about rules about network codes, it is also about infrastructures, to build the missing links so that we can create the synergies and we can exploit a larger market. Small markets, fragmented markets in the energy sector are detrimental. So we need to build this integrated, competitive, liquid, transparent market which would bring about more competition and therefore an effect on prices, but also more efficiency. And I'm thinking about Greece. I know that you are trying to develop a new legal framework, but nevertheless, in this country, the incumbent companies, both in the electricity and in the gas sector, are still very large, dominant. So there is still a lack of competition in the country. But this applies not only to Greece, as I said, but many other European countries where the market is still probably too highly concentrated. And there are also artificial factors, such as regulated prices, which influence the market. Second is about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is always good because it reduces the bill that you have to pay for electricity, because it stimulates an increased level of efficiency in all sectors, because it creates jobs and it helps in fighting climate change. However, the schizophrenic approach to energy efficiency is that because it needs upfront investments, people, operators, industries are very reluctant to invest. Even if we have reached, I would call it a leading result, a leading position in the world, we as Europe, because 40% of the world investments in energy efficiency take place in Europe, because we have managed to totally decouple economic growth from consumption of energy and emissions. Between 1990 and 2011, the growth of GDP in Europe has been 45%. Nevertheless, we managed to reduce GHG, greenhouse gases, emissions by 18.3%. And we will reach 20% target. We will even go beyond that. So this means that Europe is able to do a lot in this. In 30 years, the energy needed for producing 1 unit of GDP has been cut by half. And in the next 30 years, we'll be able to cut it by another half. But nevertheless, more can be done. Take the example of transport, take the example of buildings, take the example of industry. So this is something where Europe can do more, even if it has a leadership role in the world. Third strand is about what has been discussed at length by other speakers. We have to promote indigenous resources. We have to do more with what we have in Europe. This is the area of the renewables, mainly. We have managed to promote quite significant renewables in Europe. We have the share of renewables in the European energy mix has grown from 6.5% in 2005 up to 14% these days. So if you look at the worldwide figure, it is very remarkable, because worldwide renewables is probably below 5%. But, everything has a but. This has been reached also thanks to subsidiation schemes in Europe, which have gone against the market. In many cases have led to a situation of overcompensation. This has to be changed. And we should also avoid the fragmentation of markets in Europe. So we have to go towards a more European approach to the promotion of renewables. We have the, coming back to the more conventional sources of energy, we have this potential for new gas discoveries, both in the Black Sea and in the South Mediterranean. Let's be clear about this. The potential is not massive, which means that probably by 2025, if everything goes well, between 10 and 20 BCM might be available for European consumers from this part of Europe. And this is between 2 and 4% of the consumption in Europe. But nevertheless, this is important because this offers a new source, and this, as has been explained by Amos Hochstein, will create attract investments, create jobs in this part of Europe. And everything has to be interconnected, interlinked, as it has been explained before. Shale gas is also an opportunity. The European Commission has issued recently a recommendation which allows member states which wish to invest in shale gas to do so, and as you know, some are about doing, or some have already started to do, like the UK, like Poland, provided that they comply with important environmental rules. In particular, they have to carry out, before granting licenses, a strategic environmental assessment. And finally, the fourth pillar of this strategy is about diversification. The foreign ministers has insisted very much on the need to diversify sources, diversify suppliers, diversify routes. This applies not only externally but also internally in Europe, building the lacking infrastructures. But the key issue is what can we do in order to have a stronger weight in negotiating with third countries. And certainly we had some favorable cases and results. I mean, even Greece was able to renegotiate, as you know, the price of gas with Gazprom recently, and many other European countries were able to obtain a rebate of the gas price by Gazprom. But this mainly because we have promoted alternative sources, thanks to buying more from Norway, thanks to LNG, thanks to the change which happened in the American market on gas. So the Deputy Prime Minister was suggesting, let's go together and let's negotiate together with third countries. This was a joint proposal by the former President of the Commission, Jacques Delors, and the President, at that time, President of the European Parliament, Jerzy Buzek, who wanted to promote what they called the European energy community, which was based also on this principle of joint negotiations, joint purchase of raw materials. Is it feasible? Of course, we, as the European Commission, we can only welcome such a step. I think that it would be already remarkable if we could be able to better coordinate our action vis-à-vis our suppliers. We have had recently some examples where the 28 member states of the European Union have asked and given a mandate to the European Commission to negotiate on behalf of those countries with our energy suppliers in view of reaching an international governmental agreement. One example is about electricity between the Baltic, the network, the interconnection between the Baltic countries, Belarus and Russia. Second example is the Trans-Caspian pipeline. We have been negotiating, we hope to make progress with both Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan in view of building this Trans-Caspian pipeline, which would allow to bring throughout the southern corridor, throughout TANAP and TAP, additional volumes of gas from Turkmenistan.
May I remind you
I'm going to just to give you a third example, which around the table probably Greek and friends know very well, and this is about the intergovernmental agreement that we are today asking the Council of the European Union to agree in view of the negotiation for between the European Union and Azerbaijan in view of certifying the possibility for SOCAR, which is a company owned by Azerbaijan, to become an EU TSO and therefore to buy DEFSA and to play fully its role in the European market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Barbas. Αφού ακούσαμε από τον κύριο Hochstein για την παγκοσμιοποιημένη.
After we lend an ear to what Mr. Hochstein had to say vis-à-vis a globalized view of energy, and then Mr. Barbaso talked about the mutual understanding there is between the EU and the United States of America when it comes to energy issues. And there was also reference to the fact that you shared the views of the Deputy Prime Minister, who also discussed the single and shared negotiation stance the EU has to have vis-à-vis its suppliers. Let us now lend an ear to what the EU diplomacy has to say about energy. Mr. Yannis from the European Commission.
Εκ μέρους του European External Action.
On behalf of the European External Action Service, which is not the European Commission, but then again, you're right, we are a member of the European Union, just like the European Commission is. Let me welcome all of you. Now, let me, for my part, first commend the organizing committee of this event. Thank you for undertaking this initiative, and thank you for extending an invitation for me to participate. Let me also wish the Minister all the best, especially successes in view of the fact that we're still at the start of the presidency, and I will switch to English.
Comments which, given that most has been said already, can be cut short. Energy is clearly emerging as one of the mega themes of our times, and we all know that the world energy landscape and energy geopolitics are changing drastically, and this affects Europe in different ways. Southeastern Europe, Eastern and Southern Mediterranean are also becoming new important regions in the European and global energy maps. As most has been said, I will add a few comments from a European Union foreign policy perspective, which in a way can complement and if not complete the picture of the previous presentations. First, some wider comments about the wider context of the major changes, as it has been already been outlined, that are happening in the world of energy. The first key element is the decisive shift of global energy demands towards the emerging economies, particularly China and India, including a major rise in their own imports dependency, which should be underlined as well. Let me give you a couple of telling figures to add to the previous figures that have been mentioned. First, the International Energy Agency is telling us that electricity demand in emerging economies may push worldwide demand by 70% up by 2035. Second, the UNDP, in a recent report, told us that the world middle-class population will rise from 1.8 billion in 2009, 3.2 billion in 2020, to 4.8 billion by 2030, and with a vast majority of these, up to 90%, coming outside of the Western Europe. On the one hand, these developments present opportunities. They are signs of a growing world, one in which more people have access to better living standards, and therefore they are also an opportunity for our companies and our economies in Europe. But there are also risks. The spectacular rise in global demand can have serious negative consequences on the environment, on water, and on climate change more broadly. It can also lead to increased competition over resources. For example, the EU's share of the world energy demand is set to decrease substantially, perhaps down to 10% by 2030, 2035. There can be economic consequences as well, affecting the European Union's access to resources, our competitiveness, issues that have been touched upon by previous speakers. It can also have political or security implications, as it could affect the bargaining power of the European Union, its influence in the world, this decreased role in the energy demand market. It can affect our partners' priorities and strategic choices. It can therefore affect partnerships and priorities of the European Union. There are other major elements in this, one can call them revolutionary changes in the global energy landscape. They have been mentioned by previous speakers, issues such as the rapid development of technologies enabling the extraction of new resources. Shale gas is the first thing that comes to mind to all of us. New market dynamics and transportation possibilities, the LNG and others again come immediately to our mind. New routes, the Arctic, as well as the emergence, as it was mentioned earlier, of new producers around the world, from Latin America, East Africa, closer to here in Eastern Mediterranean, in Israel, Cyprus. And we should combine these factors with the increased uncertainty about future energy developments. Few could have foreseen just 5 years ago the US shale gas revolution, or few can tell the future technological growth in renewable energy. We are a bit in the dark. We talk about 2030, 2035, but all these are assumptions based on current dynamics, and things can change fast. And therefore, for the European Union, as for others around the world, flexibility to respond and adjust to changes will remain a key factor in energy diplomacy, energy policy. Finally, we should add to these new trends that I just mentioned the more traditional threats to energy security, such as political instability and conflicts which can affect supplies and routes. The Middle East, North Africa, politically motivated disruptive acts such as terrorism and so on. And when it comes to Europe, has been underlined earlier on, and we all know very well that energy security is of particular concern because the hard facts that we are far from being self-reliant on energy. If the trend continues, Europe together with Asia will be the only continents which will have such a high dependency on energy in the future. The challenge for the European Union is to ensure that Europe looks at these issues pragmatically and with a long-term perspective, because there cannot be quick fixes, and as things can change, we'll have to adjust. To address these broader challenges, but also the particular import dependence challenge, the European Union needs concerted efforts both internally and externally. Mr. Barbaso has already outlined the broader picture of our internal energy policy, or our energy policy more broadly. I will focus on a few elements of our EU external and foreign policy on energy. First of all, externally, we need to continue developing greater cohesion, speaking whenever possible with a single voice and showing solidarity, things that we all agree, not always easy to achieve, but we are already in a much better situation than we used to be a few years ago. The EU foreign ministers discuss energy diplomacy increasingly frequently over the last couple of years. The European External Action Service, the EU diplomatic service of the European Union, is working closely with the Commission to coordinate policies and messages, and the EU delegations around the world are becoming more active and more energy sensitive. Second, diversification remains a major pillar of the EU energy policy, and EU energy diplomacy has a major role to play in support of our diversification policies. For example, has been mentioned earlier already, by helping to ensure that we send coordinated and common messages to key EU partners for the implementation of the Southern Corridor, for example. But also foreign policy and energy diplomacy play an important role in helping to deepen our relations in our neighborhood, from where the vast majority of our imports arrive today. And this is particularly relevant these troubled days we are going through, both in the east and the south of our neighborhood. Third, looking at the bigger picture, we also need to further enhance our bilateral energy security dialogues with key players and strategic partners around the world. The EU-US Energy Council, it was mentioned earlier on, it was established in 2009 and has become a very useful regular platform focusing on addressing global, regional and bilateral energy challenges and working together to foster competitive, transparent, secure and sustainable international energy markets. We have also regular dialogues, more technical, with China, India, Brazil and many others. But we should also be able to expand, and we are working on this, our engagement with such important new players to include more systematic dialogue on energy security, on climate change, sustainable development, because without them, we may not be able to address these enormous challenges. As has already been mentioned, countries such as China and India are the new players in the energy world map, and without them, we cannot address the enormous challenges we are facing. Finally, energy security ultimately also relies on stable and transparent energy markets and on inclusive and rule-based energy governance. This is what Europe stands for, and this is what can ensure energy security in the long run. There are important initiatives underway on strengthening multilateral and global energy governance, for example, in the International Energy Agency or the Energy Charter, while new organizations such as IRENA are becoming important players, expanding their membership and engaging in global energy more widely. The EU is active in looking how to support efforts to strengthen energy governance and will remain one of the pillars of the EU energy diplomacy the years ahead. Few final remarks on the region, coming closer to our area here, the Southeastern Europe, East and Southern Mediterranean. First, has been mentioned a lot, the importance of the Southern Corridor, which is a major pillar of the EU's diversification policy. Recent decisions on the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline are particularly encouraging steps. Establishing the Southern Corridor is hopefully only the beginning of a process which will enable in the future even bigger amounts of gas to reach Europe and even greater number of countries and peoples in Europe. And the significance of the Southern Corridor goes beyond energy. It can also constitute an important additional bridge between Europe and a wider area in our neighborhood that promises to bring mutual economic, trade, political, and other benefits.
Να σας υπενθυμίσω το χρόνο μόνο.
I'm about to conclude because this was my concluding points about the region. I mentioned the Southern Corridor. About the Eastern Mediterranean, according to independent experts, constitutes one of the biggest seabed gas field discoveries in the world over the last 10 years. The discoveries of natural gas in the Levant Basin offshore Israel and Cyprus have opened new perspectives for the region. The next few months and years, as we all know, will be critical. The European Union is following developments closely. With close cooperation with the European Union, we believe that there can be success. There is an energy dialogue with Israel, promoting cooperation on issues related to EU gas market access, gas pricing, infrastructures. There is cooperation with Lebanon, as examples, and there is, of course, cooperation at the level of the Union for the Mediterranean. There was a ministerial meeting on energy in Brussels in December. The objectives are to have a multilateral regional energy regulatory framework as in the long run. Difficult to achieve now, but this remains the long run. I conclude by saying that the region is a difficult one, but there are opportunities. Energy potentials are a double-edged sword. They can bring solutions, they can bring problems. Turning the energy potential of the region to an opportunity for solution is a distinct challenge for the countries in the region and for the European Union for the next years and decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Επειδή από πλευράς χρόνου είμαστε.
And since time-wise we are running late, I would kindly ask you to ask your questions as briefly as possible. Yes, there's a gentleman here.
Να μας πείτε μόνο σε ποιον απευθύνεται.
Please identify yourself and tell us who you're asking the question to. Microphone, please. Microphone.
Mr. Hochstein, my name is Paris Kitsos. I'm managing council of Mentor Group. Mr. Hochstein, international community from reliable American sources learn that William Burns and Mr. Sullivan work too hard under Oman mediation to prepare the agreement of the Group of Six with Iran, which now started to be applicable from 20 January. I would like to ask you if your newly established Energy Division in State Department is studying Iran potential use as an additional source for the Southern Corridor, taking also into consideration that one of the historical founding units of TAP, the Swiss EGL, started exploring in the previous time this opportunity. Thank you.
My office takes a look at Iran's oil, but in a slightly different twist. We look at Iran sanctions and preventing Iran's oil exports from growing. 2 years ago, Iran was exporting 2.5 million barrels a day and was even then a net importer of gas. Today, they export around between 1 million and 1.1 million barrels of oil a day. We, as part of the sanctions laws that Congress passed, were asking remaining countries to reduce significantly their purchases of oil from Iran every 6 months. That process has dwindled the number of purchasers from 23 to 6. And those remaining purchasers under the JPOA, the Joint Plan of Action that was reached between Iran, the P5+1, led by the Lady Ashton and the European Union, meant that we suspended certain or eased certain sanctions, one of them being that countries that remaining procurers did not have to continue to reduce. However, they do have to stay at current levels. So we're not going down, but we are remaining flat. We will continue to look at that. As far as Iran's potential, I think Iran's potential is fantastic. If they were to negotiate and come to the table in good faith under the leadership of the European Union that is convening us in the P5+1 and reach a comprehensive agreement. If there is a comprehensive agreement, we can then talk about opening up for business. But as of today, no other sanctions have been lifted, and Iran's hydrocarbon cannot be exported beyond what they are today.
Thank you very much. Η κυρία παρακαλώ, μπορεί να πάει το μικρόφωνο, αριστερά.
A lady to my left.
I have a question to the European Commission, but also to the Greek Presidency, Mr. Maniatis, concerning Turkey. Turkey, indeed, especially today, is extremely important, is synchronized with the European power system, is important for the transport of gas, etc. The energy chapter is not opened. I know the European Commission wanted to open it, but unfortunately member states have not agreed on this. Where do we stand there? I believe it's extremely crucial to go ahead there, also because Georgia and Turkey are now interconnecting, etc. Why are we blocked?
Κύριε Μανιάτη, θέλετε και εσείς να προηγηθείτε, Κομισιόν.
Well, as you said yourself, the European Commission has proposed to open the chapter on energy in view of the negotiation for accession of Turkey to the EU. As you know, this is also one of the reasons why Turkey has frozen the negotiations to join the energy community, which would allow to Turkey to apply the EU acquis and to promote projects of common interest and a full interconnection with neighboring countries. So what prevents this? Officially there is 1 or 2 countries which do not want Turkey to start negotiating the energy chapter. What are we doing in order to bypass this stalemate? We have promoted with Turkey what we call a positive agenda with energy volley. We had already a number of meetings related to electricity, to gas, and others are planned in the next few weeks on nuclear safety as well as renewables and energy efficiency. So we try to cooperate even further with Turkey, pending the setting up of a more formal legal framework.
Κύριε Υπουργέ, θέλετε να προσθέσετε και εσείς κάτι?
Ναι, απλώς να υπενθυμίσω σε όλους ότι
Let me remind everyone that when a chapter is not opened, it fails to be opened not because the country is asking people not to open it, but rather because certain conditions or preconditions are not being fulfilled on the basis of the overall community acquis. And one last question, if there is one last question before we give the floor to the next panel. Yes, please, but be as brief as possible. I will try. I promise to condense what I've been meaning to ask Mr. Maniatis. I'm Thodoris Kitsakos. I am a chemical engineer, and I'm also a member of the Energy Commission of Syriza. Minister, I will try to condense in one question what you clearly referred to, because you talked about the common interest projects, and of course this is what the Greek presidency is working for. Since this United Europe's objective, after all, is to ensure there are European routes and European resources, not just in the long run or the medium run, but rather in the short run. The EastMed first. Greece and Cyprus share an expectation. They would like to see it happen. Get it from Israel through Cyprus and then in Greece through the Peloponnese and so on. But then there are a lot of articles, and have been quite a few in the international press, according to which during the negotiations between the two communities, pressure was exerted, and talks also touched on the energy market, and pressure was exerted so as to have the pipeline go via Turkey. Since we, Greece, are exercising the EU presidency of the Council, and since we are abiding to our own principles in terms of national policy, what are we doing as far as this is concerned when it comes to this matter? And then what about our own, clearly, national resources? Because Prime Minister Samaras has formally referred to getting another, or rather 150 billion from the energy market in the next 30 years. I know that there have been 3 roadshows. The moderator is breaking up the... I will conclude, says the gentleman. Given the policy and the national policy and the roadshow, do we have any clear indications on the part of the investors? Your first question was about the pipeline possibly going through Turkey, right? The reply of Greece, the response of Greece was very clear. It was crystal clear, and it was provided this week. VEPA, after the instructions of the ministry, has decided, or rather has already gone ahead and asked for a feasibility study for the EastMed. As a result thereof, we are moving forward, i.e. this project is maturing. As you probably understand, I wouldn't make a comment on any article published in the press whatsoever, because I fully trust the bargaining and negotiating power of the Cypriot government. In close cooperation with the Greek government, the Republic of Cyprus is managing the issue, and I'm sure that eventually the best possible solution will be opted for the sake of the people of Cyprus, always in line with international legislation and UN resolutions. Now, as to the second part of your question and statements made by the Greek Prime Minister, as you know, the state, i.e. the Greek public sector, in the past 2.5 years has had at its disposal something that was missing in previous decades. What we now have in the now disposal is the National Archive and Records for Hydrocarbons, and it's according to the estimates that have been made based on the research conducted. So whenever we or the Prime Minister makes a statement, this statement counts heavily on specific statistic and scientific data. Now, my response is this to your last question. My response is positive. Yes, the people and colleagues who have taken part in the roadshows and the international conferences held in Houston and London. Well, you know that half of the team is in London right now, so they are still on the way, but they have communicated with me, and overall their impression was very positive due to the fact that Greece's presence was really positive and interest was displayed on the part of big enterprises and corporations for that matter. But what I think is important is the following. Let me highlight this. Greece is pacing in the past 2 or 3 years in a really serious and steadfast manner. And we are very careful in the steps we make in all directions, be they human resources, international policies, geopolitical politics, and we always stick and adhere to the timelines we announce. And all of this is happening within a wider context and a framework which is really appealing to investors. Moreover, this framework is a framework of absolute and full transparency for the sake of the Greek citizens. And this context is really powerful in terms of environmental protection. this is the direction and path that we're going to continue walking on. One thing is certain, once international and global investors are faced with countries that have shown clear indications of geological continuity and presence of reserves, then investors do come, they show up, but of course everything will depend, and I guess will be clear by the end of the first half of 2014, or maybe just a little later, when we have the Cretan and Ionian Sea reserves bid, and we will have concession agreements eventually. Hopefully we will get the interests of serious corporations and investors so as for Greece to be on the chessboard of the energy sector. Thank you very much on that note. Let me thank each and every you, gentlemen, each and every one of you.
Και σε πολύ λίγο συνεχίζουμε με την επόμενη θεματική.
And we will pick up